Rain poured over the plains of Bengal on June 23, 1757. In the gray morning light, two armies faced each other near a small village called Plassey. On one side stood the Nawab of Bengal, Suraj ud-Dawla, commanding 50,000 men, infantry, cavalry, elephants, and French-trained artillery. On the other side, barely 3,000 British and Indian troops led by Robert Clive, a young officer of the East India Company. It looked like a hopeless mismatch. But behind the Nawab's battle line stood betrayal. Several of his commanders, led by Mir Jafar, had already promised to switch sides in secret deals with the British. When the fighting began, thunder and cannon fire mixed with the monsoon. The Nawab's guns roared but did little damage in the wet conditions. Clive's troops stayed firm, firing disciplined volleys through sheets of rain. Hours passed. The Nawab waited for Mir Jafar's divisions to join the attack, but they stood still. Confused, his army began to fall apart. Clive ordered his men forward, capturing the artillery positions one by one. When the Nawab realized the betrayal, it was too late. His army broke. The battle that had begun with tens of thousands ended with a rout. Suraj ud-Dawla fled, later captured and killed by his own former allies. Mir Jafar was rewarded with the throne of Bengal, but as a puppet under British control. What began as a single battle for trade advantage became something far greater. The British East India Company, a private corporation of merchants, now ruled the richest province in India. The conquest of the subcontinent had begun, not through a royal army, but through businessmen and their hired soldiers. After Plassey, Bengal became the foundation of British rule in India. Robert Clive and his officers walked into the treasury at Murshidabad and found more silver and gold than the company had ever imagined. Millions of pounds worth of coins, jewels, and precious metals were shipped to Britain. It was the wealth of an entire province taken in one stroke. The East India Company, once a trading body dealing in spices and textiles, now acted as a government. Clive installed Mir Jafar as Nawab, but the real power rested with British officials. They controlled taxes, trade, and the army. Within a few years, British soldiers and Indian sepoys, local recruits trained under European officers, garrisoned forts across Bengal. The company's new income came from taxation. Landowners were forced to pay fixed revenues in cash instead of crops. Drought and corruption soon caused famine. In 1770, one of the worst famines in Indian history killed millions in Bengal while the company continued collecting revenue. Meanwhile, British influence grew beyond Bengal. French power in India was broken after the 7 Years' War. Local rulers began to sign alliances with the company, often in exchange for military protection that soon became political control. By the 1780s, the company's flag, the Red Cross and Stripes, flew over Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. It was no longer a group of traders. It was a rising empire. The next challenge came from southern India. There, the kingdom of Mysore under Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan had built a modern army trained by European officers and equipped with rockets. They saw clearly what was happening in Bengal and refused to bow to the company. Between 1767 and 1799, the British fought 4 wars against Mysore. The first 2 ended in stalemates, but the British never stopped pushing. In 1792, during the Third Mysore War, Tipu Sultan lost half his territory but refused to surrender his independence. He rebuilt his army, fortified his capital at Seringapatam, and prepared for another fight. In 1799, during the Fourth Mysore War, British forces under General Harris and Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, laid siege to Seringapatam. The battle was fierce. Cannon fire broke the walls and British troops stormed the city. Tipu Sultan died fighting near the gates of his palace, sword in hand. Mysore was annexed. With the south secured, the company turned west toward the Maratha Confederacy, a powerful alliance controlling central India. From 1803 to 1818, 3 long wars were fought. The Marathas were brave fighters, but their unity broke under British diplomacy. Division among their leaders allowed the company to defeat them one by one. When the final Maratha War ended, the British controlled most of India from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Sea. The native empires that had resisted them, Mysore, the Marathas, and the Nawabs, were gone. The East India Company had become the master of India. By the early 1800s, British control had shifted from conquest to administration. The East India Company now governed millions directly. The Governor-General in Calcutta, first Warren Hastings, then Cornwallis, then Wellesley, became the real authority over India's affairs. The company used treaties and diplomacy to expand without open war. Under the subsidiary alliance system, Indian princes were forced to accept British troops in their territories and pay for their upkeep. If they refused, their lands could be annexed. Slowly, state by state, India was brought under British influence, not just by the sword, but by paperwork. British officials introduced new laws, courts, and land reforms. Taxes were collected through intermediaries called zamindars, who often exploited farmers. Profits flowed to London while Indian artisans, once famous for textiles and metalwork, faced ruin as British manufactured goods flooded local markets. To many Indians, the company appeared less like a government and more like a machine built to extract wealth. Yet it was also organized, disciplined, and efficient. Roads and postal routes were expanded, partly for trade and partly for troop movement. By 1820, British power in India was no longer challenged by any major native state. The Mughal emperor in Delhi had become a ceremonial figure with no army and no control. The company ruled an empire of 200 million people, managed by a few thousand British officers and tens of thousands of Indian soldiers. The conquest of India had taken less than 70 years. It began with one battle in Bengal and grew through war, diplomacy, and commerce until the East India Company ruled the heart of Asia. But beneath that control, discontent was growing. The company's laws, arrogance, and indifference to Indian traditions were planting the seeds of rebellion. By the 1840s, only one major Indian power remained independent, the Sikh Empire in the Punjab. Founded by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, it had built a modern, disciplined army trained by European officers. After Ranjit Singh's death in 1839, the kingdom fell into political turmoil. Factions fought for power, and the British saw an opportunity. In 1845, the First Anglo-Sikh War began when Sikh forces crossed the Sutlej River into British territory. The battles were fierce. The Sikhs fought with courage and skill, using heavy artillery and disciplined formations. At Ferozshah and Sabriyan, entire regiments fought to the last man. But British firepower and organization finally broke their lines. The Treaty of Lahore forced the Sikhs to surrender territory and accept a British resident at their court. The peace didn't last. In 1848, rebellion broke out again, and the Second Anglo-Sikh War began. The final battle at Gujarat in February 1849 decided the outcome. British artillery destroyed Sikh defenses, and their army scattered. The Punjab was annexed directly into the company's empire. With the fall of the Sikhs, the British now controlled all of India except for a few small princely states. The conquest that had begun at Plassey nearly a century earlier was complete. From the Himalayas to the southern tip of Madras, from Bombay to Calcutta, the British flag flew over the subcontinent. But the empire they had built was fragile. It ruled through fear, loyalty bought by pay, and the obedience of Indian soldiers who had begun to question who they were really fighting for. By the 1850s, the East India Company ruled directly over most of India, nearly 200 million people. On the surface, the system looked stable. British governors sat in grand halls, Indian princes signed treaties, and trade flowed through ports to London. Railways, telegraph lines, and new laws were introduced. But beneath this order, resentment was growing. The company's rule was not a government in the Indian sense. It was a business empire. Land taxes were collected ruthlessly and profits went overseas. Traditional industries, especially Indian textiles, were destroyed by imported British goods. Millions lost their livelihoods. Famines became more common, and when crops failed, the company offered little aid. Socially, British arrogance created deep divisions. The rulers believed they were bringing civilization to India, but their policies often disrespected local customs. Christian missionaries were encouraged to spread their faith, and Indian soldiers, many Hindu or Muslim, feared their religions were being targeted. Indian sepoys made up most of the company's army, commanded by British officers. They were well trained but poorly paid, often treated with little respect. These soldiers had fought and died in the company's wars across Asia, yet they began to see the British not as leaders, but as occupiers. By 1856, one more policy pushed the situation toward collapse: the doctrine of lapse. It allowed the British to annex any princely state where the ruler died without a direct male heir. This angered both princes and commoners, who saw it as open theft. The company's reach had grown too wide, and its understanding of India too small. The empire was secure in appearance, but it was standing on dry powder. In early 1857, the East India Company introduced the new Enfield rifle to its Indian troops. To load it, a soldier had to bite open a cartridge greased with animal fat. Rumors spread that the grease came from cows and pigs, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. Soldiers refused to handle the cartridges. British officers punished them harshly, calling it disobedience. The anger that had been building for years finally exploded. On May 10, 1857, Indian sepoys at Meerut mutinied. They killed their officers, freed prisoners, and marched to Delhi. There they declared allegiance to the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, a frail old man who suddenly found himself the figurehead of a rebellion. Within weeks, the uprising spread across northern India, from Delhi to Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, and Bareilly. Whole regiments joined the revolt. Civilians took up arms, seeing a chance to push the British out. For a brief moment, it looked as if the East India Company might collapse completely. But the rebellion was not united. Different groups fought for different goals, some for faith, others for freedom, others simply for revenge. The British regrouped quickly, calling reinforcements from Punjab and sending new troops from Britain itself. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters in India's history. Delhi became the center of the rebellion. Rebels fortified the ancient city and proclaimed Bahadur Shah Zafar as emperor once more. It was a symbolic act, a return of Indian rule, at least in name. The British knew they had to take Delhi back. In June 1857, forces under General Archdale Wilson advanced from the north, supported by Sikh and Gurkha regiments still loyal to the company. They surrounded the city and began a long, brutal siege. Artillery batteries pounded the walls day after day. The defenders fired back with captured guns, but ammunition soon ran short. Inside the city, food dwindled, disease spread, and discipline broke down. Outside, the heat and stench made life almost unbearable. Both sides suffered heavy losses. In September, the British launched their final assault. Engineers blew open the Kashmiri Gate and troops stormed into the streets. Fighting raged house to house for 6 days. The ancient Mughal capital, once one of the world's great cities, became a battlefield. When it was over, Delhi lay in ruins. Thousands were dead. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, tried for treason, and exiled to Burma. His sons were executed. The Mughal dynasty, which had ruled India for 3 centuries, ended in a single week. The fall of Delhi broke the rebellion's heart, but fighting continued elsewhere. The British retook Lucknow after a long siege and crushed resistance at Kanpur and Jhansi. The cost was immense. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians died on both sides, and entire towns were destroyed. By the spring of 1858, the rebellion was over. The East India Company had survived, but just barely. In London, it was clear that private rule had failed. India would now come directly under the British Crown. By 1858, the British government had seen enough. The East India Company, once a trading firm with warehouses and contracts, had turned into a government ruling millions, and then nearly lost it all. Reports from India told of massacres, executions, and cities reduced to rubble. London realized that a private corporation could not control an entire subcontinent. The British Parliament moved quickly. The company was dissolved, and all its territories were transferred directly to the Crown. The Government of India Act of 1858 marked the end of company rule. A new office, the Secretary of State for India, was created in London to oversee all affairs, while a viceroy replaced the company's governor-general in India. The change was more than administrative. It was a shift in purpose. The company had ruled for profit. The Crown claimed to rule for stability. Queen Victoria issued a formal proclamation that year. It promised equal treatment under law, respect for Indian religions, and an end to annexation through deceit. The message was meant to heal the anger left after the rebellion. But behind the promises, the power structure remained the same. British officers still commanded the army. British civil servants still ran the courts, taxes, and railways. Indians could now join the administration, but only in minor roles. The language of rule changed from company to crown, yet the empire's foundation stayed firm. India was no longer a business possession. It was now the jewel of the British Empire, ruled directly from London. The conquest was complete. In the years after 1858, the British worked to rebuild and reorganize their new imperial possession. The rebellion had destroyed trust, so the new Raj focused on control. The Indian army was restructured. British soldiers would now make up a larger share of the force, and Indian regiments were carefully divided by region and religion to prevent unity. Delhi, once the heart of rebellion, was occupied by large garrisons. New railways and telegraph lines were built rapidly, not for convenience, but for troop movement and communication. Military strategy was disguised as modernization. Roads linked garrisons, not villages. The empire's main goal was to prevent another revolt. Yet the British also began to present their rule as a civilizing mission. Schools teaching English opened in major cities. Universities were founded in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Indian elites were encouraged to adopt Western education and serve as intermediaries. Some did. Hopping reform could come through cooperation. Others saw clearly that the system favored British interests above all. Economically, the Crown's rule tightened its grip. India became both a source of raw materials and a market for British goods. Cotton, tea, and opium were exported on a massive scale, while British textiles flooded Indian markets. The traditional economy collapsed further. Farmers were pushed into debt. Famine struck again and again, Orissa in 1866, Madras in 1877, and millions died while grain was still being exported overseas. Politically, the Raj presented itself as stable, just, and benevolent. The Queen was declared Empress of India in 1877, a title meant to show unity under the British flag. Ceremonies and parades were held to display imperial glory, but the Indian population had little say in how it was ruled. The empire ran on loyalty from a small class of Indian officials and soldiers, and the silent obedience of the rest. The methods of the East India Company had ended, but its logic remained: profit, control, and order above all. The British conquest of India reshaped not only the subcontinent, but the modern world. In just over a century, a private company backed by a distant island nation had taken control of one of the largest and most diverse populations on Earth. The conquest was not the work of kings or crusades. It was built through contracts, trade, and armies paid in silver. Under British rule, India's landscape changed completely. Railways stretched across deserts and jungles, carrying soldiers and goods. New cities grew around colonial centers. English became the language of administration and higher education. Western laws replaced many local systems, and the Mughal model of governance disappeared. But the cost was enormous. India's wealth was drained to fund Britain's industrial rise. The great textile centers of Bengal and Gujarat were destroyed by British imports. Agricultural reforms forced peasants into poverty, leading to repeated famines that killed tens of millions over the next century. For the first time in recorded history, India produced more raw goods than finished ones, and much of what it produced left its shores. Culturally, the empire created a divide. A small educated class began to rise, influenced by Western ideas but rooted in Indian identity. Out of that class came reformers and nationalists who would later challenge the empire itself. The very tools Britain introduced, the press, the railways, the English language, would one day help Indians organize their own movement for independence. When historians look back on the British conquest of India, they see a paradox. It brought roads, schools, and order, but also exploitation, famine, and subjugation. It united India under one administration but divided its people by class, religion, and race. By 1858, the conquest was complete, but the story of resistance, reform, and eventual independence was only beginning. The British had arrived in India as merchants and left as rulers. The East India Company had traded in silk, tea, and spices, and ended up trading in power. The conquest they built outlasted them by nearly a century, shaping both nations forever. For Britain, India became the empire's crown jewel. For India, it became the lesson that no empire lasts forever. The red flag that flew over Calcutta and Delhi would one day come down, but the memory of how it rose from a small trading post to an empire that ruled a continent remains one of history's most remarkable transformations. It began with a battle in Bengal and ended with a crown in London.